For most of this lesson, we're going to be developing a gradebook class that an instructor might use to represent information for a course that he or she is teaching. And as we proceed through the next several lessons, we'll continue to develop this gradebook class to the point where when we cover arrays, we will build into the class arrays of information regarding the grades for students in a course. In this chapter, we'll be focusing on primarily the fundamental concepts of object-oriented programming and starting to build our own new class types from which we can create objects. So you can see here the folder in which this first version of the gradebook is located. I'm going to go ahead and load that into my IDE right now. And as I proceed with you through this lesson, what I'm going to do is introduce all of the key concepts of creating a basic class definition. Now, the first thing you'll notice after I've loaded up the project into the IDE here is that this particular project has a gradebook.cs file and a gradebook.test.cs file. The gradebook.test.cs file, if I open that up, contains our main method that's going to say what this program should do when it's up and running. And the gradebook.cs file contains the new class called gradebook, and it's a very simple version of the class to get us started, but we will then enhance this over the next several examples. Now, before I get into the code in detail, let's talk a little bit about classes, objects, and methods and data. When you are building a class, one of the things you're trying to do is model a real-world concept. So if you think, for example, about the concept of a car, before you can go drive a car, somebody has to design it. They have to build the functionality into the car that allows you to interact with the car. So for example, when you step on the gas pedal, it makes the car go faster. When you bring your foot off the gas pedal, it makes the car go slower. Or if you hit the brake pedal, it slows the car down as well. And there's other capabilities built into the car that allow you to interact with the car. Those capabilities are the equivalent of methods in a class. When you define a method in a class, you are defining a way for somebody to interact with an object of your class and tell it to do something, just like when you press the gas pedal on the car, it tells the car to go faster. It basically sends a message to the car to say, let's go faster. So that's the concept of a method. The concept of a class would be like the engineering drawings for a car or the blueprint for a house, where you are basically describing how this thing works, what it takes to accomplish its tasks. So for our initial gradebook, all we're going to do is define one task, which is going to be to display a message on the screen. And like I said, we will continue to enhance this over the next couple of examples, where we'll start to introduce how to build data into a class, how to manipulate that data, and throughout the whole thing we will create objects and interact with them through our test classes, our gradebook test classes that contain the main method. Now, I'll just go ahead and run this program first so you can see it in action. Similar to what we did at the beginning of the previous lesson, all it's going to do is display a line of text, in this case, welcome to the gradebook, on the command line. And again, the IDE is displaying press any key to continue so that we can look at the output and dismiss this window when we're ready. Now, the way we performed that task was in our main method. Every program has a class that contains main. That's the launch point for the application. And in this main method, what we are doing is using the new gradebook class that we're going to create in the other file to declare a variable of that new type. Every class you create defines a new type that you can then reuse in your app or in many apps if you place it into what's known as a class library. So I'll come back and look at main with you in more detail in just a moment, but basically just quickly showing what this does here. Line 9 creates a gradebook object, and line 12 tells that gradebook object what to do. It tells it to display its message. So we'll come back to this momentarily. Now going back to our gradebook.cs file, it's not a requirement, by the way, but in general you'll only define one class per file. In this case, the class we're defining is a public class called gradebook. The first step in making a class reusable is to declare it as a public class. In this lesson, we'll be talking about the keywords public and private. We'll start to talk about private as we introduce data to you in a subsequent example. But basically, anything that's public is quote-unquote publicly accessible. Anybody who has access to class gradebook is allowed to use its public features, and you can only have access to a class if it's a public class in the first place. So if I'm creating a reusable class that I want to use through many applications, it would normally be placed into what's known as a class library, and it would be defined as a public class within that class library. Throughout the .NET framework, there are thousands of public classes, but there are also non-public classes that you can't see that are being used behind the scenes to support those public classes as well. So again, if you want to create something reusable, it will typically be defined as a public class. Now, just like our classes in the preceding lesson, all classes start with the class keyword followed by a class name, and just a reminder, the convention for naming your class is capital first letter and capital letter on each subsequent word in the class name. And in this particular class, we have a body that goes from lines 6 through 12 and just one method in its body. Now, one difference between this method and the main method is that you do not see a static keyword here. Again, main is special. It has to be declared static. Most methods that you define will be non-static methods that are specifically defined in a class so that you can talk to a particular object of a class. In this case, we don't have any data yet that we're manipulating. We're simply going to tell our display message method to write a line of text consisting of the string "Welcome to the gradebook" with an exclamation point. Now, syntactically, most methods you'll define, but not all, will start with the keyword public, followed by a return type, in this case void, saying that the method does not return a value, followed by the name of the method, and by convention, method names have the same naming convention as class names, capital first letter and capitalization of each subsequent word in the name. And if the set of parentheses following the method name is empty, that indicates that the method takes no parameters and therefore does not require any additional data to perform its task. And in this case, the only thing we're going to do again is to write a line of text to the command line. Now, the reason for the using directive back here at line 3 is that the class called console cannot be used in your code unless you first either say that you're using classes from the system namespace, which is the namespace that contains the console class, or unless I say system dot in front of console here to explicitly say that the console class comes from the system namespace. So if I comment out line 3, then what happens is I get this red squiggly line here indicating that the name console does not exist here in the current context, the current file. Again, that's because I am no longer saying that I'm using features of namespace system. So again, I can go and say system dot here, and that error message will go away, and it will work as written if I want to run the program. In fact, let's just show you that. So I'll start without debugging, and you can see that it works fine if you fully qualify the class name. My personal preference is to use using declarations when I'm writing my code, but some companies prefer that you use fully qualified names all the time. Now, the class gradebook that you see on the screen here is not executable by itself. You have to have a main method in order to be able to run a program. So we've now described the initial functionality of a gradebook object by defining this class. The next step is to go ahead and create an object of that class and tell it to perform a task. And that's the purpose, again, of the gradebook test.cs file. So here we see the class gradebook test. Once again, I've defined it as a public class, and within that class we have a main method, and the shell of that method looks identical to the main methods we showed you in the preceding lesson. Within main, we tell the program what to do. And once you start creating your own classes and using objects of those classes, you have to actually tell the runtime to create those objects. And that's what we're doing here at line 9. We'll start doing this with lots of different classes from the .NET class library, the .NET framework as well. But for now, we're doing it with our simple gradebook class. Now, the way you create an object is first you declare a variable of the new class type, in our case gradebook. The only variables we declared in the preceding lesson were integer variables. Here we're creating objects of a new class. And when you create an object of a class, you must create the object by using the new operator. So when I say new gradebook with the empty parentheses here, what that does is it creates the memory for a gradebook object, and the result of this operation is actually what we call a reference to the new gradebook object that was just created in memory, and that entity called a reference is stored in the variable named myGradebook. So what I like to say is that I have an object called myGradebook, but in reality what that is a reference to a chunk of memory that represents that gradebook object. Now, once you have a gradebook object, as we now do here in line 9, at line 12, we can go ahead and tell that object to do something. And the syntax for doing that is the variable name that refers to the object, followed by a dot, and then the name of the method that you want to have the object execute. So myGradebook.displayMessage says to the myGradebook object, I would like you to go display your message, and the fact that the parentheses are empty after display message indicates that this method requires no arguments to perform its task. Of course, you have to call the method in a manner that matches up with how it was defined. Over here we can see that display message takes no arguments. So for example, if I go back to the call here and I were to say let's pass it in the string hello, then I wind up with a big error message because there is no version of display message that takes arguments. So you are going to be required to call the method in a manner that matches up with how it was defined. Now at this point, the program transfers control from line 12 into the display message method, which then writes the line of text. When the method completes execution, it's going to return back to line 12, and at line 13 the program is going to terminate. And what I'm going to do now is run this in the debugger so that you can see that flow of control. So I've gone ahead and clicked in the margin indicator bar at the left side of line 12 here so that I can run this in debug mode and have the program stop executing temporarily at line 12. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, once I do that, the program highlights in yellow the line of code that's about to execute. Now, a couple of things about what you're seeing on the screen here. When you run in debug mode, the debugger automatically displays these windows at the bottom of the screen. The locals window shows you any variables that are currently accessible to the function that's executing, the method that's executing. So we have the parameter args, and we also have the myGradebook object. Notice, by the way, when I hover over myGradebook, it shows me that that is a gradebook object, so it knows that at runtime. And now what I have at the left side here is an arrow pointing to the line that's about to execute, and I want to step into that method to show you the method executing. And for that purpose, we have the debug toolbar up here, and this icon is called the step into icon. You can also press F11 to perform this task. I'm going to click that button, and you see it now transferred me from the gradebook test.cs file over to gradebook.cs, and we're now about to execute the body of the display message method. So I'm going to go ahead and step into this function, and I'm going to execute the write line statement. I'm going to use step over for this purpose to just go perform that task rather than going into the source code of the console class that's defined as part of the .NET framework. And at this point, line 10 has been executed, and I can actually go ahead and pull up the window in which it's displaying the results. Welcome to the gradebook was just displayed. The program has not terminated yet because I'm in break mode at the moment, and now the next thing to execute is going to be returning from the display message method. So I'll go ahead and do that. Now we're back at line 12, and we can step through and complete the program's execution. So the purpose of that exercise there was to show you that control is being passed from my test program's main method into the gradebook class display message method specifically for the object called my gradebook. And as we proceed through the next several examples, we will eventually create multiple gradebook objects, and we'll show you that each individual object maintains its own data so that we can have many different gradebook objects in a program.